speech on the national debt. Now, I know I'm not supposed to begin with a quote because I do it every time. I'm going to do it one last time. I'm going to begin with this quote because it's so good. It comes out of this was a famous hymn from 1916, and that was taken from a William Blake poem. So this is an excerpt from that hymn. And this hymn became the British Labour Party campaign slogan in 1945. And it goes like this. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. So that was kind of their hymn or their rallying cry. And the British Labour Party promised to build a new Jerusalem out of the rubble of World War II. They wanted to create a new society. So New Jerusalem was an ideological partisan plan to nationalize industry and build a welfare state. Now, nationalizing industry means kind of the government taking over a private industry. And so the British Labour Party in the late 40s, they came to power, and they nationalized what's known as the commanding heights of industry. And the commanding height simply means the largest and most important industry. So back then it was the coal and railway industry. So they nationalized industries, they established a series of welfare programs. The biggest and most important welfare program was the government healthcare system. That's known as NHS today. The result was that within 25 years, Britain was bankrupt, and they had to receive a bailout from the IMF, which was they basically received a bailout from the United States and Europe, and that was in 1976. So the largest, the greatest country in the world was kind of reduced to begging other countries for money because they'd basically gone bankrupt. So the moral of the story is how well-intentioned policies can cause a systemic debt crisis for a nation. So obviously, the question is the United States going down that path today? So, but keep in mind, if it is, that in the 1970s, Britain had the United States and Europe to fall back on. But whereas today, if the United States goes bankrupt, we don't really have anybody to fall back on. We don't have, no country in the world has the wealth or economic power to bail us out if we go under. And no other country really has the military power to kind of keep order in the world. So it's very important for us not to go bankrupt, obviously. So some of the current policies that are creating a debt crisis in the United States. We had an $800 billion stimulus plan. We had nationalization or bailouts of banks, mortgage companies, car companies, and student loans. We have a $1 trillion healthcare plan with unsustainable entitlements and promises that are built into it. So, and we also have these massive increases in our yearly federal budgets. So I mean, even the president's OMB chair has said this is unsustainable. We can't keep spending money like this. So in order to make sense of the public debt, it's basically measured against the nation's economic output. So you measure kind of the economic wealth of the nation versus its debt. And that's known as GDP. That's the economic output. So at the end of 2008, America's debt to GDP ratio was 40%. By the end of 2020, it's going to be 90%. Now historically, America reached its peak of debt to GDP ratio right after World War II. And it was 109%. So we're quickly approaching this massive debt load that we achieved during World War II. Now these are CBO numbers, the Congressional Budget Office. That's a nonpartisan agency within the Congress. One thing to also understand is that when you compare World War II debt to our current debt, World War II debt was based on kind of discretionary, temporary spending. So after World War II, we were able to cut back on all of that spending that we committed onto the war effort because the war was over. But our current debt load based on entitlements, and these are systemic. You know, our current debt load is kind of built into our society, so it's going to be very difficult to cut back on that debt. So problems that are generated by government debt, there's kind of a loss of sovereignty where other nations own us. We have to make interest payments. Money that should be spent in America has to pay for, you know, spent on investment, has to go out to pay our interest on the debt. There's no emergency fund anymore. If we have another World War or Great Depression, we're going to be kind of maxed out on our credit card. We're not going to have anywhere to go if we, you know, our debt will already be so great that we won't have an emergency fund to fall back on, basically. And as I said previously, if we go bankrupt, you know, we could have chaos in the world, basically. So at the heart of this problem is a kind of a crisis of ideology. Policymakers are spending money recklessly, in part because one party controls all branches of government, or the two most, you know, they control Congress and the presidency. We had a similar problem when Republicans controlled everything. You know, they spent like crazy too, just a few years ago. So, but now it's kind of exponentially kind of out of control. So when one party controls government, there's a problem. So solution number one is vote Republican in 2010. You don't have to vote. You don't have to vote for Republicans in, you know, in 2012, but in 2010, just to balance out, you know, the spending, vote for, hold your nose if you have to, but vote Republican. Because if you look back to the 1990s, we had a Democrat president and a Republican Congress, and that was the last time that we balanced the budget. So solution number two is we have to implement pro-growth policies. So we need to invest in technological innovation, entrepreneurship, and kind of break up these inefficient corporations that have a kind of a symbiotic relationship with government. You can do that with antitrust laws, for example. So the bottom line is, you know, what kind of opportunities are we going to leave to our children? So you got to think of the future and stop the reckless spending and unleash the energy of our people.